Hi, this is Joe, and welcome back to the shop. In this video, we're going to do an introduction to electrical wiring and how you make connections to electrical wiring. As you can see here, I have a piece of paper with a bunch of different sized wires. In the U.S., electrical wiring is sized according to the American wire gauge system. There are two different types of wire in the American wire gauge system. You have stranded wire and solid wire. As you see here, these are all various sizes of stranded wire. Stranded wire and solid wire each have advantages and disadvantages. We'll talk about those advantages and disadvantages in a little bit. The American wire gauge system is based on a mathematical formula that we won't go into in this video, but you can look on the American wire gauge chart. I'm going to include a link to that chart in the description of this video. Basically, wire is rated according to the size of the wire. And the American wire gauge refers to that size as gauge. As you can see, the gauge they're referring to has to do with the diameter or thickness of the wires. The thinner the wire, the higher the numeric value or gauge. So as you see here, we have on this piece of paper, we have a 26 gauge, 24, 22, 18, and two different wires that are 14 gauge. Now, as you notice here, these wires are different colors. Wire gauge is independent of color. The wires can come in any different color, so color does not determine wire gauge, nor is the thickness of the insulation or type of insulation on the wire directly related to wire gauge. For example, we have two 14 gauge wires here at the very top. The insulation thickness is greater on the top 14 gauge wire than the second wire on this piece of paper. And the reason for that is the type of material that this wire insulation is made of determines the thickness, but in no way does insulation reflect the wire gauge of the wire. Wire gauge is directly related to the diameter or thickness of the wire. American wire gauge also specifies the maximum amperage that can safely be transmitted through each of the different wire gauges. For example, 14 gauge, according to the American wire gauge system, can handle safely a maximum of 32 amps of current. So if you look at the chart, each one of these different sizes of wire or gauges of wire can handle a different amount of amperage. And it's pretty apparent that the thinner the wire, the less amperage that can be safely handled by the wire. And the thicker the gauge, the more current that can be safely handled by the size of the wire or gauge of the wire. Now, in our home projects, our do-it-yourself projects, we normally have to take wire and we have to use that wire to connect various components together. For example, on an electric bike or an electric scooter, we use wire to connect various components, such as we connect the battery to the speed controller, we connect the battery to the throttle, and we connect the battery to various other components like brake lights, headlights, etc. So it's very important to understand the proper ways of making connections to various devices using wire. So let's talk about some of the tools that we need when we're joining wire to various components. Wire is usually sold on spools or in rolls. As you see here, I have various size wires on either large spools, some smaller spools. You'll have to have some tools to work with the wire. Let's take a look at some of those tools that you're going to need. Wire cutting is usually performed with some type of a wire cutter. Here we have some wire cutters, and these particular tools here just perform cutting. Then we have some multi-purpose tools. This cuts the wire, strips the wire, and crimps connectors onto the wire. So you're going to need some way to cut your wire. For example, if I want to cut a section of this wire, I would just come in with my wire cutters and cut the wire. Now, as you notice, the wire does have an insulation on it, so there has to be some way to take this wire and join it to either another piece of wire or to a particular component. In order to do that, you have to strip or remove a section of the insulation from the wire to expose the copper core. And the best tool that you use to do that is with a type of a wire stripper. Let me show you several of those options. Here are several wire stripping tools. These tools cut and strip wire. This tool also cuts and strips wire. And as I said earlier, this tool cuts, strips, and crimps wire. So how do they work? This particular tool right here, it basically has a set of teeth, and it grabs onto the wire. It makes a break in the insulation, and then you can simply remove the insulation, and now you have available copper wire that you can work with. As I said earlier, this type of a stripper will strip pretty much most common smaller size wire gauges. If you get into some larger gauges, these teeth on this stripper are not strong enough to strip the larger wire, so then you have to use a different type of stripper. This particular type has teeth for a particular gauge. So let's say we take this particular, which is an 18 gauge wire, we put it in the hole and we squeeze, and as you see, we strip off the insulation on the wire. So you're going to need at least a cutter and a stripper to do your basic wire operations when you're joining components on your do-it-yourself projects. Now that you've cut and stripped your wire, let's say you now want to take that wire and connect several components together. Well, there's several different ways of doing them. You can solder the wire with a hot soldering iron and some solder, which is usually a combination of silver and lead. Or you can use a series of different types of connectors. Now, as you see in this picture, we have some terminal connectors. These are little circular rings that usually go on some type of a terminal or a nut and a bolt, something that looks like a nut and a bolt. Now, as I said earlier, the color of the wire does not give any kind of indication or has any meaning toward the gauge of the wire, but terminals and connectors do. So as you see here, we have a connector here, a male and a female bullet connector. They're red in color. Then we have a box here with some terminal connectors, and those terminal connectors are yellow, blue, and red. Now in connectors, the color does indicate the gauge of wire that these connectors are made for. So for example, the red color connectors are for 22 to 16 gauge wire. The blue connectors are from 16 to 14 gauge, and the yellow are from 12 to 10 gauge. So wire color has absolutely no reference at all to gauge, but in connectors, color is everything. So you want to make sure you choose the proper connectors by the gauge of wire that you're using. What I'll do is I'll show you how you would use a bullet connector. I call this a bullet connector because the little male end sort of does look like a bullet. So I refer to these as bullet connectors. There's also butt connectors, which allow you to take two pieces of wire and butt them together and crimp a connector on there to join a section of wire. You also have other types of connectors. I mostly use, unless I'm doing a temporary connection or a connection that needs to be removed and replaced on a regular basis, I usually do soldering. It's much more robust, it's better, but in some cases you have to use connectors because you want to disconnect. Let's say on an electric vehicle or electric bike or scooter, you want to be able to remove your battery for charging purposes, or in case when the battery gets old you want to replace the battery with a new battery. You should always use connectors because then it makes it easy to remove and replace that particular component. So let me show you how you would use crimpers to crimp some of these connectors onto your wire. Here I have a 22 to 16 gauge bullet connector, and I have 22 gauge wire here. So I can use, this is a type of a crimper, and this is a multi-use tool. Notice at the very tip there's a red dot, a blue dot, and a yellow dot. And in this case we would use the red dot because this type of connector is red. Okay, so first thing we would do is we would take our wire. I usually like to twist the wire. It gives it a less chance to fray when you're inserting it into the connector. Then if you notice there's a little pin and a little indentation in the crimper. We're going to take that connector, we're going to put the wire in properly, and then we're going to squeeze the pliers, and you notice now the male portion of the bullet connector has now been crimped to one side of the wire. We now can take the other wire, insert it into the female portion of the bullet connector. Again, sometimes I really like to twist these wires so they don't fray. And as you see now, we have a male and a female bullet connector. To make connection, you just push the male into the female. You now have a temporary connector that you can connect and disconnect. So that's how connectors work, and you need a good crimping tool. These, I don't like to use these too terribly much because they're not as nice of a crimper as this. This is more of a professional tool that I picked up at the local big box store. Now, connectors are great for temporary connections or connections where you need to connect them and disconnect them. But for permanent connections, you always want to solder your wires together. Now let me set up and I'll show you how we're going to do that. This video is getting a bit long, so what we're going to do is stop here, and in the second part of this video we'll start talking and showing how to do soldering of wire using a variety of different soldering irons and different gauge of wire. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.